about Syria itself, including how the state is constituted, peace-building prospects before the war is over, and on accountability, such as it is. First up is going to be Jomana Tagore, who is a civil society representative to the UN-sponsored constitutional negotiations, which have stalled until recently. Maybe they've still stalled. Jomana now leads the Syria effort at the Atlantic Council, runs an NGO providing relief in Syria, and holds a JD from the University of Kansas, and is also getting a doctorate. I discouraged her, but she's still doing it. Getting a doctorate at the Georgetown University Law Center, where she already has an LLM. Jomana, the floor is yours.
Well,
You can stay at your seat.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending, and those of you who are following us online. Thank you, Professor Serwer, for always trying to make sure that Syria deserves some attention. I just, so I'm part of this effort. Professor Serwer wanted me to talk a little bit about the Constitutional Committee. I'll begin by just laying out just generally what the process was. Actually, 2 years ago, October 2019, the UN finally, after years of negotiations over how to proceed next, decided to put together a 150-member constitutional committee. 50 members of those are from the Syrian government, 50 members of those represent the formal opposition, and then 50 of them are a mix of, they call it the middle third. And the reason they call it that is because there are, half of them are sent from Damascus. So there's technically no civil society in Damascus, but they sent them as, businessmen, lawyers, professors at the University of Damascus, etc. People basically not in formal positions of government to come and negotiate on behalf of the government. And then there were the rest of us, the other 20 to 25 of us are called independent members. And so I don't represent anyone but myself, although I'm a Syrian and an American. And so this effort has, we initially started off with meeting in Geneva 2 years ago. And to this day, there's now been they just finished their 6th round last month. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, the 6th round, the 5 rounds before this, absolutely contained no substance. They would meet and they couldn't even agree on what to discuss, what subjects to discuss, let alone to agree on any constitutional text, to consider. This was the first time in Geneva where 4 specific topics were identified. They were on the issue of sovereignty of the Syrian Arab Republic, the rule of law, military insecurity, and then terrorism and extremism. The round ended, by having introduced some text, but of course, nothing that was agreed upon in terms of, any text that would satisfy these 4 subjects. And basically everybody went home, and now they're reconsidering the methodology, even of how these things are addressed in Geneva. And there probably will not be another round until January. That's really sort of the main overview. I'll say a couple of things, though, about this. I'd like to say a few things just generally about this process, however. Now, on the one hand, I think the one positive thing about this process was that it was the first time that a constitutional committee effort anywhere in the world included members of civil society, like a formal way of introducing members of civil society to participate in constitutional conversations. And this sort of precedent, I know, by those working on Yemen was seen as, an interesting way to kind of impart upon Yemen, the inclusion of women. There's about 30% women. I mean, these things were, I think, on the micro level were good things. I mean, we can agree that they were generally good efforts. But the problem was, and the problem remains, is that really the macro level of this process is not one that is actually leading Syria to a peaceful resolution, a negotiated resolution of Syria's most important and most pressing issues. When this process was initially launched, and I know that previous envoy de Mistura really tried to get this off the ground, And the idea was always to have the constitutional process be one of several different parallel tracks to address the issues of the Syrian people, to include issues of detainees, to include ceasefires, unfettered access to humanitarian aid, as well as a transitional government. Now, unfortunately, the only thing that has lasted of all those baskets that were articulated in 2254, UN Security Council 2254, was the Constitutional Committee. And I think even as a constitutional, as an aspiring constitutional legal scholar, I can say that while the Constitution of Syria does have many problems, even at face value, it absolutely enshrines almost all power, any substantive power in government, in the hands of the president. He's able to dissolve the parliament. He's able to appoint judges. I mean, there's absolutely no, checks and balances or separation of government, branches of government. But that being said, fixing serious problems cannot be done solely by changing language in a constitution. The most important part of changing Syria's trajectory comes first and foremost by a constitution that's actually implemented, but a constitution that does, embody a lot of the things that I would say at least half of Syria's civilians, have asked for, have demanded, and many who have sacrificed their lives for. And so now we're in a place where we have this process that might have been something, I think, at one point in Syria's time, but is really struggling to remain relevant. So even though it was created, and very much so pushed by the Russians to be a release valve, as a, it was meant, by Russia, it has turned into a release valve just to, address some things superficially by those who oppose the regime. While those who, those of us who've been part of this have been looking as this actually more as we were initially looking at this as a vehicle for reform, which it has not really, at least so far, become. So I don't want to say too much. I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll have some follow-up questions, but those are my initial remarks.
Thank you, Jumana. Next up is Majid Al-Khatrif, who is an assistant professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins, but also holds a master's degree from the School of Advanced International Studies. I should also mention that he and his wife run the superb restaurant in Ellicott City called Syriana, which all of you should visit at the earliest opportunity.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the Minute Club for organizing this event. It was a lovely, lively discussion in the first panel. Probably, I think I would like to split my section into 4 short subsections. One that deals with what are the problems Syrians are facing that are not commonly addressed. Second, the potential role of civil society, the barriers that's facing, and lastly, possible solutions to enable it to take on that role. As for the problem, as we've seen today, most of the discussion internationally and in DC relies on the international ramifications of the conflict and the political conflict itself. What's usually lost is the impact on the society. Over the last 10 years, now 11, with a stalling political process, brutal war, and devastating economic consequences, you have social degradation throughout. The society is just disintegrating under pressure along many social schisms. They took the facets of sectarian, tribal, urban, rural, nomadic, agrarian. All these are manifestations of the same struggle, people striving to secure food and health with an ever narrowing definition of us versus them. And that is the main problem. And this has ramifications both at a structural system. Whatever solution is being engineered for Syria, you have to have a local social structure that can take on that role. Whatever solutions, political, constitutional, if you don't come with communities that can execute them, there wouldn't be any fruitful outcome. So from geostrategic stability, from a political solution perspective, this is a priority. It has been dealt with as an unfortunate byproduct, while it's actually the foundational problem. And maybe this is a call to make it as such. Now, I can speak on the localities of these struggles. I'm from Sweda in southern Syria. I was just there. I spent 2 months in the summer. Half of it was social, half of it was field work. And I got to examine kind of some aspects of this local conflict that we had in the context of ISIS attacks in the region. There was an attack against Sweda people in the eastern villages. An unfortunate situation, 250 people died, 37 women were kidnapped. A major tragedy for a part of Syria that actually was not exposed to war. So things are in context. This is a shock to the society that has been spared the pains of war in general. Nonetheless, I went there now, and there is severness of relationship between these villages and their neighbors of nomadic tribes, with whom they had long-lasting relations, socioeconomic, of trade, of protection, and it invoked a primordial struggle that takes on a facade of a Druze versus Sunni struggle, when it is actually a nomadic versus agrarian society settled. And the problem, whenever people discuss it in international realms, they take the facade. It's a Druze versus Sunni. And actually, it's easy here to be heard in any venue. If you identify as such, if I'm speaking about a structural problem, it's boring. If I'm speaking about minority protection and Druze issue versus Sunni, it's a flare, and then you get the attention. So there's some structural problems in dealing with the Syrian situation that makes it actually more problematic to solve. It's as if Isaac Newton sat down under the tree and saw the table coming down, and so there's a particular problem with that apple and the piece of land below it. And that definitely would have not led them to any discovery of gravity. So we have to look deeper into these structural issues that are actually driving the conflict and making people less likely to work with each other, and cause a major destruction of the society. A World Bank report mentioned that came out I think 2017, estimated that social disintegration and economic disruption contributes to 80% of loss of GDP in Syria, more by magnitudes than the actual infrastructure destruction in assets. So this is the problem. Now, the role of civil society in this, I think it's not just a role, it is the role. No one can handle such devastating situation across the community with any state. With the state is very shrunk, it cannot take on. International community cannot take on. The only sector that can take on this is civil society. The problem is that most of civil society that has evolved during the conflict has reproduced the conflict. It's hardly that you can see one organization that can work across Syrian territories and help all Syrians. We're all pigeonholed in specific territories, first by local political structures that constrain if you work here, you don't work here. Second, by the donors with political agenda that you can either work with this fund in this area, you cannot work with this fund in this area. So in a way, civil, and this is represented in the Constitution, where you have the civil society is mainly politicized structurally. It's not by intention of people to be political, it's just because they function within the conflict structure. Now, the barriers that against civil society to work for a potential constructive role and take this on, this major responsibility, is, as I stated, local powers preventing them. Second, donors constraining them. And thirdly, Syrians among themselves. Somehow, whenever anyone speaks in reconciliatory terms of thinking of all Syria, there's a tendency to frame this as you're negating the pains, the actual direct trauma that happened to people in war. While like here, kind of you put a moral responsibility to the dead ahead of the moral responsibility towards the living. It's not to say that should be a focus away from the former. It should be as equal to focus on the moral responsibility towards the millions that are still struggling through it. Solutions would come from, along with these barriers, is the things that we can solve. Is first at the level of policymaking. We're here in the U.S. speaking about donors. Is to have a priority for looking at the structural elements and targeting them as an essential geostrategic goal into this realm, and privatize that to the civil society in Syria and allow them to work as a priority. The USAID has a conflict resolution program. You would think Syria has a conflict. There should be an announcement for Syria program to invite conflict resolution initiatives. There's not. So that's a policy level that we can advocate for. Lastly is Syrians among themselves. We have to step out from the conflict and transcend it. We all have the luxury of work outside of political structures. Whenever we have the chance to help to reach out to the other, recognize their shared agony with us, I think that's our main responsibility. If we don't do it, no one would. Thank you.
Thank you, Majid. We turn last but not least to justice and accountability. Mohammed Al-Abdullah runs the Syria Justice and Accountability Center, SJAC, to its friends, which among other things has collected, organized, and analyzed a truly gigantic database of crimes committed in Syria during the more than 10 years of war. Caveat emptor, I'm on the board of SJAC, so I speak nicely about it. Mohammed has many distinctions, including a master's degree in public policy from George Mason and work for Human Rights Watch, but perhaps the most relevant for current purposes is his experience as political prisoner in Syria on 2 separate occasions for his work defending human rights and lobbying for political reform. Mohammed?
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the audience here and online. I would like to start by characterizing and picking up from what Majid just, the excellent presentation Majid just gave about the social disintegration in the country, that by saying a lot of disintegration, disengagement between societies and communities is grievances based, and those societies have faced challenges that human rights violations, sometimes existential human rights violations, like displacing a whole town and a whole city or a whole province from its location, where people are looking at the other side as just merely as the enemy, because scarce of resources, as Majid mentioned, and lots of other reasons, but also it's a grievances based. So if you want to discuss anything related to justice and about redress and making people whole back together, we have to address the grievances they have. Now, we have a narrative that's not super popular about accountability and justice itself, because we look at justice as something different from accountability. Accountability is a criminal accountability, punitive justice. If somebody made a mistake, committed a crime, killed somebody, had a violation, they should be held liable for it and they should go to prison for it. And this is how it works in general crimes. Would criminal accountability and punitive justice produce justice to the community and to the society and redress? Not necessarily. And this is something we've seen in Bosnia and the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and ICTR in Cambodia, and so forth, so on, like a lot of examples. That there's a whole set of programming and engagement that needs to take place inside the country that goes beyond punishing those who made wrong and committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's focused on reconciliation, focused on truth-telling, let everybody tell the truth about what happened to them from their own lenses and point of view. Of course, we will result with 20 versions of truths, because everybody has their own perspective on truth. However, a good documentation could actually back up a good solid narrative for what happened in the conflict in the country. And this is what we're trying to do by collecting this gigantic data and database. Institutional reform is one another area where if you want to prevent reoccurrence of what happened in Syria, actually we have to change those very institutions that produce the level of violations and the level of disengagement and isolating Syrians and blocking them from contributing and participating in their governance system. And none of this actually could happen through just criminal accountability. So that's a problem here. And that's why what Majid is proposing is very solid proposal and a good idea, because engaging in the civil society level and the social engagement and trying to bring communities to work together and work across communities could establish that level of elements of reconciliation, if you want to call it this way, and start introducing a narrative that never heard in the conflict in the last 10 or 11 years. And that could encourage people to start working cross-line, if you want to put it this way. Now, there's a lot of humanitarian organizations trying to do this work. SAMS come under fire, Syrian American Medical Society came under fire a couple of times because they wanted actually to operate in Damascus, in the regime-controlled area. Even it's a humanitarian medical mission, which is you actually provide medical care to anybody who's in need, regardless of their political affiliation. They got under attack from the revolutions or the uprising population or the supporters of or anti-Assad community. Same discussion with the sanctions. We came a lot under some pressure when we published a report arguing sanctions are actually not effective. And you see Rami Makhlouf's son driving a Ferrari in Los Angeles, not even in Syria. And then you laugh about the comments made to Congress, bold lies sometimes, unfortunately, that, Caesar Act is depriving Assad from the resources. And they're just running to the negotiation table just to make the reconciliation that we're thinking of or descending for a peace agreement. Now, this, of course, does not mean we should not pursue criminal accountability, and that's very, very clear line here. But sometimes the discussion is put forward is it's a peace versus justice, and this is a very important topic to unpack because for the Russians themselves, for a lot of the regime allies, think, if you want to put them in prison and put them in tribunals and courts and start sentencing people to prison term, you disincentivize them to go to the negotiation and sign a peace agreement. Of course, nobody will sign a peace agreement saying at the end, by the way, you're going to court or you're going to prison. But the proposal of justice versus peace is a fake proposal, because if you don't have some accountability, if you don't have meaningful justice and change in the society, you're not going to get a lasting peace. You're going to get a small stabilization efforts and small management or control of a conflict, but you're not going to get actually anything lasting without working with transitional justice framework, not necessarily a pure accountability framework. Now, one final point is important to mention that Syria does not have actually an international tribunal, neither a referral to the International Criminal Court nor a special tribunal for Syria, because Russia vetoed the referral attempt in 2014, Russia and China. And of course, after the Russians engaged in Syria militarily, they will be more inclined to veto any attempt to refer Syria to the ICC in the future or establish a tribunal. Now, what's left for Syrians is actually following those bad guys to Europe who made it with the refugees and try to identify them and take them to courts in Europe, relying on a principle called universal jurisdiction for human rights. Basically, a country's national court could put people on trial for crimes committed against people in another country or the crime committed outside, like Germany, Netherlands, Sweden. There's a lot of cases. Maybe the most famous one is the trial of Anwar Aslan in Koblenz in Germany, the former chief of the investigation branch and the state security intelligence, facing charges in Koblenz. Now, that does not mean the work for accountability should not continue and the fight for accountability should not continue. But I have discussed this. Not sure, Daniel, if you overlapped with Yuk Chunk from our board in the early time, Yuk from the Center of Documentation in Cambodia, Documentation Center of Cambodia, DC Camp. Yuk worked hard, really. His family was victims, of course, of what happened in Cambodia, of the genocide, and worked hard on documenting the events and shared the data he had with the criminal tribunals or the extraordinary chambers in Cambodia. But he appeared on New York Times first page when the verdict came out and said, from the beginning, we knew the tribunal will not fix anything. So when I asked Yuk about this, is that in the last 10 years, I spoke to 1,000 classes between universities and high schools and local communities and town hall meetings. And that shows the level of social reintegration, if you want to reintroduce it back and do that work, whether through humanitarian lenses when you have suckers of resources, and that's a good compelling case to put forward, or through discussions and truth-telling efforts. Now, the truth is a lot of the regional powers and international powers, I support here what Majid said, but not as donors per se, but as regional powers and political interests, they don't want to see this happening. And not only they don't want to see this happening, it means like, oh, you're fueling our conflict and we're the innocent. No, they are fighting and competing against each other, but also among each other. So you take the opposition camp when you see the Saudi, Qatari, Emirati, Turkish camp, we're all against Assad, but all were fueling and arming people against each other and supplying arms to their opponents. You would understand why such proposals for social engagement in the level of Syria is very difficult. Now, I want to pause for a second and go back to 2003, because part of the momentum we had in the civil society after 2001, during Damascus Spring, after 2000, before we ended up in prison in Syria, basically, and Assad told everybody, like, yeah, we give you a space, but not that much. Basically, a group of activists in Daraya, southern Damascus, tried to do exactly the level of services providing and community help support that Majid spoke about, and that was not tolerated by the Syrian government. So what they did, actually, they collected garbage when the government was unable to accommodate this area very well. They cleaned the streets. They did a campaign awareness about some of the diseases and hygienes, but they ended up in prison. Some of them ended up in prison for 2.5 to 3 years in a military detention facility. Now, what is tolerated today, and this I want to bounce back to Bashir, it's a good question to throw you under the bus in this. How much is this going to be tolerated? Is it going to be tolerated because we're in need now, so we're going to make it happen, and now we're going to be in that same fake trap, like we believe that we can do some work in Syria, we ended up in prison. Like the regime will allow people to do this cross-community, and then at the moment when they feel comfortable that actually they don't need that extra support from outside or from civil society, they're going to block everybody from doing it. This is one important aspect. The second item is that regardless of resources, we have inherent disengagement and disintegration in the society that's ethnic, religious, even regional. Sometimes people from the same sect, from the same religion, but you know what? Like when the displacement happened from Douma and Damascus suburb to the northern of Syria, the refugees in those camps are actually organized in camps and lines based on where they came from. Although there are also needs all fought by the government, all kicked out and displaced by the government. And they were actually kind of organized themselves in small ghettos based on their, like, if you want to put this way, regional background. Now, this, of course, if you cross the river northeast, is going to be more problem. I'm from Deir ez-Zor. I'm going to speak about this in the Q&A. But Deir ez-Zor people hate the Kurds for a reason they don't even know. They're Kurds, and we should hate them because they're Kurds. And this statement itself is difficult to unpack because there's a history of fight between the Arabs and Kurds in 2004 that was a little bit related to the Iraq War, where the Arabs labeled the Kurds of being traitors and working with the Americans. And that led to a riot in Qamishli and the Kurdish area, where the Kurds actually paid the price for that protest, but nobody protested with them to endorse them. And that ended up being crushed immediately in 2004. I'll stop here. I'm happy to jump in more details.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. You've challenged Majid a bit, so I'm tempted to give him the floor
as well. That was good.
and urge him to respond a bit on the question of, how much do you think you can really get away with?
Yeah, so it's
It's a discussion, really. I'm like,
no, sure. No, I think, and this is a major challenge, and here I bring the restaurant, and kind of I will just put the head of the entrepreneur. Kind of the mindset here is one of exploration of solutions, given a context of power structures and what it allows and what it does not allow. It's not about changing the political structure as much as working within it in a reformative fashion. So one unfortunate reality of what happened in Syria is that the devastating shrinkage in state capacity in service provisions due to loss of resources and the bleeding of the workforce. And now, after the war, we are bleeding, I think, from one source, there's documentation of 600 youth fleeing Syria daily to neighboring countries. Daily, and those are just young. We have an operation in Sweden that was dealing with COVID. 50% of our staffing is gone, just in a matter of months. So within this, if you look at state level, there is shrinkage in service provisions. There is incapacity, and that creates a space for civil society to work. Now, if you find a formula that's not antagonistic, it does not come against sovereignty issue, against shaming, I can give an example, for example, like the Daraya case, one can frame it as you're challenging the local government that you are incapable, and they crush you, because basically you're not in the business of showing us bad. So if you found that angle, that's the reliance, that's the entrepreneurship of providing services that comes complementary to public sector services, that does not antagonize and come against as threatening. And this applies actually in the three territories, whether in Syrian government controlled areas, whether in the autonomous area in the northeast or in the northwest. Like you have to work within the political structure, see what works to help the people, engineer an enterprise that is apolitical by design, focused on service provisions rather than any political contamination. I don't know if this recipe would work, but usually that's how business about. You try something, it fails, you try something else.
So I would just say on the civil society point, and this is actually something that was emphasized in the Constitutional Committee, is that the members, and that's why I struggle to call them civil society members that were with us in the middle third, that are coming from Damascus, because they made a point to say, we are not mujtama madani, we are not civil society. They said we are mujtama ahli. We are, and I was trying to figure out the exact translation of this, but they do not, to them, the idea of civic, as opposed to civil, but they do have a problem with being called civil society, and they understand that the government has a problem with referring to them as civil society. And even within our negotiations, there was no, there was nothing ambiguous about them saying, we need to ask the Ahmed Kizbari, the head of the government group, about what we can and can't say. Like it was very bizarre. They were supposedly there as independents, but they weren't actually there as independents. So I do challenge you. I think what you are putting forth, I think, is absolutely something necessary. My nonprofit works in Idlib. We can't even operate in northeast Syria. The Turkish government won't allow that. Any NGOs that work in northeast cannot work in northwest, and vice versa. And we all know that in many of Turkish-held areas, it's something we've talked to the Turks about a lot. They do not allow for independent local governance mechanisms. A lot of those local governance mechanisms in areas specifically held by the Turks, so not all of northwest Syria, there is a mechanism through which they have to work with the Turks. And so while humanitarian provision is permitted in a lot of these areas, creating any alternative governance structures anywhere in Syria, I think outside of the controlling parties, has become incredibly difficult, if not impossible, I would say. And the last thing I would say to this is, which is why when it's come to this Constitutional Committee negotiations, one of the things that many of the independent members have tried to push for is some notion of decentralization. It's trying to get some, local community organizing, maybe humanitarian provision, maybe the election of, very, low-level bureaucrats to come from the area itself, as opposed to being appointed from Damascus for the central government. And even that, of course, has not so far gained traction.
Can I jump in? Yes, I was going to ask you in particular on Deir ez-Zor.
Sure, I'll speak to Deir ez-Zor, but I want to just add one thing here, is that we have two problems with this approach that has more challenges, if you want to call it this way. One is the nature and the very virtue of the regime. That's basically the way it's structured, the way it does not actually compromise even 1%. In 11 years, half of the nation is displaced, but they still say there was nothing happening. Like just terrorists showed up, we were combating terrorism, end of story. So that's a very challenging aspect to engage. And of course, they're under pressure because sanctions and COVID, and they're unable to fulfill the needs of their constituents. They might be loosening up in some areas, mainly humanitarian and food and medicine. But also the other phase of the failure here was the civil society and the leadership of the opposition prior to the conflict. And this is a part I was part of basically in 2000, since 2000. So the civil society was mainly dominated by people who were either former political prisoners who came from ideologies of political parties, regardless whether Muslim Brotherhood or Communist Party, but they came with a focus on the political rights, strictly, narrowly on the political rights. We want to fight the government over freedom of election or freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of movement. But we did not actually focus on any social and economic rights. And we let that space really, really empty. And the person who filled that space was Asma al-Assad, the first lady. She was really smart in it. That's a very big area, has a lot of potential resources could come from the West on it. And it is the language that the West loves to hear, like what protection of children and women rights, and basically all the things that she was trying to promote and promote herself as like a Western-oriented first lady. And she filled that space. And at some point, we found ourselves in a confrontation with the community in Syria at large because of what the first lady is doing. And I give a very concrete example here in a minute. Honor killing. Honor killing is recognized by the law in Syria. If somebody killed a female member of their family, they will get a very low sentencing, if not full waiver of the punishment in a court if they say it was an honor killing. The female person was engaged in a sexual relation outside of marriage. We were fighting for this to be amended. We were pressuring the government to amend this. And we did a lot of proposals, right and left, and we ran them to embassies, to international organizations. The first lady was doing the same thing at her own term. And they eventually, after a lot of the pressure we did, and a lot of lobbying and campaigning, a lot of exposing to the Syrian government failure to recognize this problem in the penal code in Syria, they ended up adapting that, changing it, amending the law. But she took a credit for it. Publicly, she's the one who made it. Let alone in a Friday prayer, all the mosques in Damascus attacking us and naming activists, saying those are the people who allowed sex out of marriages. And you want to address them, they live and work on these places. So they took our work, put their label in it, took their credit in the international scene, and they put us in the face of the society internally inside Syria. They will play these maneuvers in all of these things, and this is problematic. Now, going back to Deir ez-Zor, Deir ez-Zor is a very unique province, not because I'm from there, because the people from Deir ez-Zor, they always think they were actually forgotten. It's a province that unfairly treated in Syria, that has a lot of resources but had a little development comparing to other places, and always characterize it that way, that we're the forgotten province in Deir ez-Zor. The dynamics in Deir ez-Zor are unique in the sense the tribal nature of the suburb around Deir ez-Zor presents itself in the day-to-day politics of the city and in the province. And the tribes historically has been divided between the usually loyal to the government, loyal enough to the level that actually they can get their business done. And this is exactly the same phase of the game you're talking about, Majid. Basically, okay, we'll work with the government. Usually every big tribe has one or two people in the parliament in Damascus sitting in an election, usually not fair or free, but those people elected. So from one sense, they're assured their presence and participation is guaranteed through bringing them to the parliament. And that's how they assure their constituents that we can take care of you and your businesses. From the other side, those tribes internally, they do not have one voice and they do not have one decision. And the government always fuel those basically cleavages between branches of those tribes. And that was very visible when the fight started in Syria. After the opposition picked up arms, some tribes decided they're going to stick with the government. But some of their families, if you want to call them clans, sub-branch, decided, no, we're going to sit actually with the rebels because the government is unfairly killing everybody. So you get the same tribe having two positions. Some people, of course, thought they're being a little bit snarky. They're sitting with both sides, so whoever wins, they can guarantee their next seat in the parliament. But it's not that, actually, although it is an existential threat for lots of the tribes. Same thing happened when ISIS showed up in northeast Syria. We got the tribes pledging allegiance to ISIS publicly. And they go to them, they agree with them, they take pictures, and they agree to work with them. some of their branches, they disagree with that and they picked up arms against ISIS. And the famous one is the Shaitat tribe, who had 1,600 members of their males executed by ISIS because they decided they're going to fight against ISIS. But then the Americans come with SDF to defeat ISIS and kick them out, and they pledge allegiance to SDF and work with SDF now. So that flip-flopping, not only they being opportunistic, it's not that, it's actually, there's no trust in the system, in any governance structure that you can actually work with and be principled to. You have just to ally with whoever comes next to guarantee your existence. And this takes me to a very general statement about the whole presence of tribes and sectarian groups and regional groups and religious groups is actually one of the very clear signs of the basically failure of the state and showing one identity for the Syrians. We have a big identity crisis. Started with the second flag introduced in Syria in 2011 quickly, or in 2012, for no clear reasons. In Libya, Gaddafi was crazy. He painted everything green, and people didn't like the green flag, and they went back to the old flag. In Syria, the flag the Syrian government uses actually was not by the Assad family or al-Ba'ath party. It's by the Syrian people and the parliament itself. Like, it was a free parliament back in the 50s. So all these questions, when you put it on the table, the same when what Jumana mentioned exactly, when the white helmets proposed to cross the river and go fight the fire on the season of wheat in northeast Syria, which could feed the entire Syria, and the Kurdish administration says, no, let it burn, but we're not going to let you cross because you work with the Turks. This gives you exactly the level of challenges you're going to be facing when you work cross-community, cross-sector groups, and cross even regions, even with the same background.
So this makes me raise a question to you, because tribes are a little bit of a mystery to Americans. And I remember long ago when Amatzia Baram, in the aftermath of the American invasion of Iraq, wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, when you get the tribes on your side, you'll win, basically. And he was right. And that's more or less many intricate developments. That's more or less what happened in the Sunni areas. So what role is there for tribes? And aren't tribes part of civil society? And should they be recognized as such? And are they only a problem, or are they also an opportunity?
Anyone?
Well,
I'm looking at you, but never
well, I
mind.
think we can all probably say something about this. I mean, I think in many ways, a lot of Syria has become tribal. I mean, not just the formal tribes in Deir ez-Zor, but I mean, looking at when you're talking here extensively about social disintegration, I mean, people have gone back very much to certain identities. We see neighborhood identities as very dominant. People identify themselves as people being from X city versus Y city. It's become very difficult to say. It's not enough to just say I'm Syrian anymore. People want to know, well, which side were you on? What neighborhood were you from? Because stating which neighborhood you came from says a lot, most likely, about your political affiliations. Same with your religion. It's always uncomfortable, I think, for Americans to talk about sectarianism or different religious tensions, but that's a reality in Syria that I think in some parts has become more of a problem than in others. I mean, some places, and we could talk about this, especially in Sweden, it tends to be more homogenous, but they have other issues that, divide people in Sweden. You look at Homs, where, that's the city I was born in, and you have, villages that are much closer, and, Alawi villages, and your Christian villages, and your Muslim villages. You have a lot more disintegration there from village to village that might not necessarily be very far apart from one another. And so I think we were talking about this during lunch, is that your identity has become such a important part of how you perceive yourself, and the kinds of things that you then defend, for example, in constitutional committee negotiations. I mean, those who are more Sunni, you find advocating for certain things as a bloc, even though maybe years ago that wasn't their primary way of identifying themselves. And same for some the minorities of Syria. I really don't like to use terms like the minorities of Syria, but you find, for example, the minorities from northeastern Syria may see eye to eye about pushing for quotas where minorities in other parts of Syria might not necessarily want the same type of mechanism in order to ensure their rights. So I think that is that's what I have to say about the tribalism issue. But
Yeah, so I think, thank you very much. So I think there are two components to tribalism. There's the metaphorical term that we use, which is basically this collectivist block behavior, where there's no agency for the individual, just kind of this is my block and this is my core identity and we're all moving the same. And this is the pattern that Jumana mentioned. And this has become, it's a symptom of collapse, basically. Kind of when you say when you speak about U.S. domestic policy as becoming tribal, just be worried, because that's kind of where you lose that individual fluidity, and that's the separation. There's the other element, which is the core original term, which is kind of a political form of human organization that's fluid, not akin to space. Its relationship, it's more with internal block. This is the nomadic pastoral life tribalism, which is different. It has kind of more solid tribalism. Kind of that's the only identity, actually. The individual does not count. It's what the whole thing would do. And that has been, I think this is what you're referring to, Daniel, in terms of understanding the tribes getting like the thing in North Pakistan and Afghanistan. They don't have loyalty is not as negative. It's just they feel they're not bound to these political realities. These are nomads that are not attached even to land. They move, their only presence is them. So they see these external political structures are imposed, arbitrary. They have no value. That's why for them it's easy to change allegiance by what preserves the community. And you can see this back to the 1300s. Like Ibn Khaldun described them, and there's a big dichotomy between the urbanized and the nomadic people, because it's different political structure. And whether the problem with them as civil society is they're not organized in such fashion. They come with specific, also, for example, if you become educated and urbanized, you are not a tribal person anymore. So it comes at that they should be at play, but their representation is usually the sheikh, the elder, not the technocrat. So that's why they are an issue for even kind of the Syrian government before the war. Like I was involved in one of the clashes in 2000 between Bedouins and Sweda people. It was a pastoral agrarian, like the herd grazed an agricultural land, and it takes kind of Sunni Druze, but it was basically just the herders ate the plants, and they're always an issue. And an issue in terms of just it's a different political system, not as inherently problematic.
One final thing I would add is the existence of tribalism and other fashions of expressing political alliances, let's say, clearly predates the state, and it's a sign of distrust of any existing governance structure. So people do not trust the state, so they go back to their religious or to their sector group or to their tribal group or to their region or to their, and that was also present in the name of the armed groups. When people start forming armed groups to defend their areas, it's very local, like Jaish al-Harbi Arabin and the Free Syrian Army of Arabin and the Syrian Army in Duma and the Free Syrian Army of, like sometimes it's neighborhood to neighborhood. It's governed by different people who belong to that neighborhood, and that part of it is actually because all these identities at crisis at once, and it is in a competition, and this is what Amin Maalouf says in his amazing book, Killing Identities, is basically the identity the most at risk is the one going to reveal more, because people want to show that identity. And it's like when the Muslims feel they're discriminated against in the West and they start identifying themselves, I'm a Muslim American, not American Muslim. But when they're relaxed, actually all the racism goes to the Hispanic, for example, during Trump. I'm like, no, we're American Muslims. So forth, so on, if you put it this way. The government in Syria historically played that game very, very well. Bribed the tribes, got their leadership to be loyal, regardless of what the tribe themselves would be in agreement or not. And when they did not have any other options, they had to follow the government. When other alternatives became available, here where we saw visibly that the tribes are actually splitting and becoming two branches, and every branch is siding with one side of the conflict.
Thank you. I'm gonna open the floor to questions. Ibrahim.
Thank you. This is really, really great discussion. And always when we talk about civil society, I think initially we think we're going to talk about some small details, but it's really the core of the conflict. We went very deep because we're talking about the social contract in Syria, which I think is at the core of the conflict. Mohammed, you mentioned about how Kurds and Arabs in there, so they hate each other. And I think I totally agree with you. Because I think by default, human beings we hate or we distrust in order to protect those we know and we trust. So without a social contract, by default, we hate, we distrust. And you also mentioned the flag. The 3-star flag that is used now was actually established in the Constitution of 1930 by the French. One was for Damascus and one was for Aleppo and one was for Deir ez-Zor. And then after 6 years, those 3 entities came 1 star, and the other star was for the fact that the Alawites, and 3rd star was for the Druze and Sweda. So I would argue that usually we say that the colonialism divided us. Actually, the French put us together. Because otherwise, most Syrians, they didn't want to be in one state. But we didn't grow up with that narrative. We don't know it. We say, no, we love each other and this is our country and we have that national identity. But if you go deep down, there is that mistrust and that social contract that was never developed and never evolved to reach to a point where people love and trust each other beyond their civic or tribal or sectarian or city identity. You know, people in Damascus and Aleppo, their identity to the city.
Or behind the wall in Damascus.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
inside the
It's
wall
like
and
which
outside the wall.
neighborhood, and then which, and then how far are you, my first cousin or second cousin? So my question to you, how much do you think centralism, which I think is a very, very important question for the future, and Assad, that the point of Assad always prevents us from asking the real questions. How much do you think that Syria, part of the conflict, is that Damascus was the center and controlled the rest of Syria, and many of them had grievances, especially in Deir ez-Zor and the northeast, for decades, and they didn't talk about it until they exploded. So in the future, can Syria really be controlled again by a central state, or it should be at the core of any negotiations? Decentralization, build it bottom up, and look at other civil wars where people were able to live together like this very country. After the civil war, without decentralization and federalism, probably they wouldn't have been able to survive. So is that something we should always talk about, especially for civil society, to be able to have grassroots initiatives and regenerate or probably build a real social contract for the first time, bottom up in Syria?
You go first.
I can go first. I can make your job difficult about the Constitutional Committee because I attended 3 rounds in Geneva around the civil society support room, which is part of the civil society participation of the negotiation. And this is exactly the line that sums up the conflict. We don't want to live together. And we were forced to live together, and we were forced to stay together. And can we develop a mechanism or a formula where we can live together, or let's call it end and basically and separate each other? And like if you look left and right in Iraq and Lebanon, and you will see 2 countries where at least Iraq was super centralized till the moment that the centralizing power was removed, and we've seen what happened in that country. And you look at Lebanon with also the rich and diverse religious and ethnic presence in the country did not actually help the country to become more prosper, but actually played a negative role in the civil war. Personally, I think a big part of the problem in Syria is that we're not only centralized by force, like the country, but also the government or the governance structure is corrupt and bad. So I'm all for decentralization. But even when you approach the question of decentralization, when the decentralization questions start to come up, one of the human rights, when a civil society group in Turkey did a survey among 1,000 people, like 1,000 Syrians, 90% of them, they said federalism is bad. I'm like, of course, like when you go ask people, what do you think of federalism? And all they know is the Kurds want federalism. They're going to tell you it's bad. Like also federalism has a million level between decentralization and all that. So without explaining to people what this would mean and how a government carry part of the burden from the central government and provide services to the local people because they know their needs more, they'll be accustomed. But also it's a burden on the local government if the central state does not give you. And then we've seen that in the KRG when Maliki deprived Kurdistan from their resources, and they ended up selling oil outside the country, which is unconstitutional. But this is how it's happening. So I think we need a lot of education and awareness about decentralization and the value of it. But also, I'm against decentralization if it's based on sectarian and religious lines, because one thing maybe good about the Iraqi constitution, it does not actually reinforce that. It remained the way it is, but by default, the north is Kurds, the middle is the Sunnis, and the south is the Shia, and how this is how it imposed or reinforced the sectarian lines. But that's a question also to Daniel. From other conflicts, like people doesn't want to live together really. Like, what can we do? Other than separating them.
Well, it's a tough question, and I think it's highly dependent on the particular circumstances and what is physically possible. I mean, when I think of Syria as more mixed demographically than homogeneous demographically. I mean, even the so-called Alawite areas of the West, they're not the provinces were not majority Alawite. The countryside, some of the villages are all Alawite, but the towns are quite mixed, and actually Sunnis were in the majority, if I remember correctly, or at least plurality. So I think of Syria as more mixed than a lot of places I've dealt with, certainly more mixed than Iraq, where in Iraq you have a very clear division with large expanses of the country essentially belonging to one, if you could call the Sunnis all one group. They're not really, because there are many different identities within the Sunni group, but the West is Sunni, and the North is mostly Kurdish, and the South is mostly Shia. So, and that's not really true in Syria. Syria is more mixed, and where you have mixed societies, I think it's impossible to draw a line. And if you try to draw a line, what you do is you trigger conflict and ethnic cleansing, and that's the whole debate in Bosnia about it, the whole debate in Kosovo about it. The reason it's a bad idea to draw a line is because there is no line that will put everybody on the so-called right side, and the result will be conflict and a lot of death and destruction. But by the same token, I do believe decentralization, especially in Syria, where there's been this extraordinary efflorescence of local councils. I mean, this doesn't always happen. It didn't happen in Iraq. It did happen in Libya. Why? I don't know why it happens in Syria and Libya, but not in Iraq, not in Egypt, not in, but it seems to me a very positive development that when people are deprived of governance from the center, they create their own institutions, and it was the real threat to Assad, seems to me, was that capacity for local organization. And I will hope that the Constitutional Committee gets back to that question eventually.
I would just add to what Mohammed said, and I mean, I think Ibrahim, your question is a very important one about can we force people to live together who do not want to live together? And I think that's a question, again, coming back as Americans, it makes us very uncomfortable because we live in such a unique country. And most countries in the world do have national majorities of a particular religion, particular ethnic group, or at least a group that is more dominant than everyone else, so that parity is impossible. And there's no threat from this minority that may come and outnumber them, etc. And so, but in Syria, where you do have a majority that is ruled by obviously a non-majority, but a lot of other groups who are not from who are part of that minority who don't necessarily want the ruling minority, and they also don't want to be part of the majority, which in our case, for example, is the Kurds, who do see themselves as a distinguished, ethnic group. And if they could have their, ideal world, would want an independent state of their own, and then let everyone else fight over the rest of Syria and move on. But I think striking the balance between a non-corrupt, the specific term you used about it being a corrupt central state, having a non-corrupt central state balanced, correctly with local governance mechanisms, something we've never achieved in Syria, and frankly, in most of the Arab Middle East, I think is also very lacking. In Bosnia, just having looked at this question recently, there was obviously mass ethnic cleansing in order to homogenize certain parts of the country, right? So that the Serbs went east, the Croats and the Bosniaks went west. And even though, but it's so decentralized, and you know this, Professor, it's so decentralized that it's at a complete deadlock. Like they cannot get regular things moving in the government. And with Iraq, also the level of, like, there is a central government, but it's decentralized, but you also have a corrupt central government. And so all these other post-conflict scenarios that we've seen haven't really embodied, I think, an example that would be as beneficial to Syria as possible. And it's something that we may have to create, over time on our own. And I certainly think some of the, lines of the ceasefire lines are cementing over time. The Northwest does for more or less look like Gazification inside of Syria. And I don't know if that's ever going to change. And they may feel more comfortable there than their reintegration into part of Syria. I think those questions, time will answer them. I don't think it's clear quite yet.
If I may, so I wanted to revisit the premises of it. So the French came, so first you look at the Balkan, Syria, these are post-imperial structures, like the Ottoman Empire collapsing, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsing, and you have the modern state imposed on these structures. And it came in a bit naively. There's no process of organic ethnogenesis that happened that formed these countries. So there are a lot of local communities used to work in a loose imperial structure that the identity issue was not a concern. So now you come and then you try to modernize these societies in both realms with these new constructed identities that they existed culturally. So Syria culturally existed, like since the Romans, they call it Syria. And so actually it's for Assyria. That the Assyrians ruled that all east. So for them that was all like Coile Syria, that's all Syria. So there was, for the outsider look, they know that there's something self-similar in this region that is one thing. And that's how the French came and then they drew the lines. And the Syrians, so first they created the states. The Druze state was a French construct because again, there's no concept of state. These where we didn't have local policies. They didn't exist. They're all about like vilayets of the Ottomans, and they keep shrinking and expanding based on the strength of the Persian ruling. So the French divided the states, and the Druze, they had a rebellion, and they called it the Great Syrian Revolution. Not that it was framed as Druze, but it was against separation. So people wanted to be together. I'm not sure that they wanted to be together from the beginning. Now the format that brought them together, this is what they hated. It's a different issue. I think the modality of centralization that allowed first the rule of the elite, whoever that elite is, to govern from Damascus, whether it was the elite Sunnis or the elite Kurdish militaries in the 50s, or Nasser came, like that centralized, that disenfranchises the periphery is what was wrong. So it's a matter of poor governance rather than whether they wanted to be together. The result was an opposition and a view of the fringes of being left out, and we want to opt out. So I think it's as a result of poor governance rather than an inherent hate for being together, because we have empirical evidence that they actually fought to be together. Now, how to move forward? The issue I have with decentralization is that it's seen now as a solution for the identity crisis we have. So basically, it gives the space for people. This is kind of like if these identify as such, we give them their own space so they feel empowered and self-governing. So let's see, kind of Switzerland is a decentralized government. Do you know anyone who identifies with their local county or whatever political? I don't know what's the political structure even in Switzerland. You know them as Swiss. They are governed locally, but it's not a matter of identity. It's a matter of best business practices. If you have a corporate and a franchise, if you're managed from the central office, you will fail. If the local management office is securing its vendors, finding solutions for marketing, etc., you will succeed. So it's more of a governance modality rather than an expression of identity. And this is the problem now, kind of when we spoke, kind of you don't want it to be a representative of sectarian or ethnic sub-identities, and the issue that Daniel and Jumana, kind of how you put the line if you want to be representative of these identities, it's impossible in Syria. So for me, kind of that's just a best practice of governance later on. It can be geographic based on what is best for that community in terms of finding solutions for executing its day-to-day operations. It's not a solution for identity. Syria wouldn't work but one Syria. If it's fractionated, you can go back to history. Whenever it's fractionated, it's vassal states for others. Go back. I'm working on a project that goes back to the Neolithic times. And it's always, when it's fractionated, you are a proxy for others. The only time that we could be self-sufficient is when we have a Syrian state. As bad as it was Pax Syriana in a way.
Thank you. I'm not sure I entirely agree about Switzerland, but we don't have to debate that today.
I don't know them. It's not visible to the others.
I think it's a question of how you identify inside the country versus how you identify when you're traveling abroad, which is true of Americans too. Americans that identify with their states and their local communities when they're in the United States, and then there are Americans outside. Please stand up and yell loud because you're very far away.
Good afternoon. I am Ali. I am actually not a PSY student. I'm here with the Syrian American Society. SAMS. So I wanted to ask a question about the medical infrastructure and the role of NGOs in particular in Syria, because it's like as with my work, Northwest Syria is very much run by a lot of humanitarian organizations. There's 50 different midwife schools, and there's all these different programs that, like you're gonna have to reunify at some point. And then you got the central government in Syria, like in Damascus and all those places where it's like the care is, there's less women's health options, but there's a lot more doctors and there's a lot more hospitals and there's like a stable infrastructure, but not a lot of access to certain kinds of treatment. So, I was wondering if you guys had like any recommendations for like possible ways to bring that together, or to like the importance of that, of being able to bring in humanitarian organizations and nonprofits into like bringing them to the table in the rebuilding process, because they do prop up so much of what is left.
Rajid, I think that's for you.
That's yes, yeah. So that's the physician and me now. So yes, actually, I've just written a paper currently under review on health and peace, and it relates to this health issue and the fragmentation in the health system, and this is where it's the nature of the beast. Health systems are systems, so they have power elements, so they tend to reproduce the political structures. They have legitimacy issues, like if you provide my health service, I'm loyal to you. So any ruling party would want to provide to be the self-provisioning aspect. So there's no incentive for collaboration there. There is big money, and that money also gets co-opted in the struggle. So political parties would want that money that's coming to the health service. And that leaves the actual core of healthcare, which is an interpersonal relationship between a doctor and a patient. The patient must trust the doctor. That's in every health transaction. If you don't trust the doctor, you didn't follow, you didn't go to them. So there is a trust and there's a caring from the physician towards the patient. And those are the antithesis of conflict. But somehow they get washed out in these big logistical aspects of healthcare that makes them actually more pro-conflict than for conflict. The solution, they're top down, it's impossible because that's tied to the political structure. The idea is whether you can have something organic. Again, that comes back to the entrepreneurial aspect. And I think we'll just have had a discussion about it. There's a severe shrinkage in service domains of all these de facto powers. Like the health system in Syria is focused in hospitals. Like that's it. Like you get sick, you go to the hospital. Outside in the community, there is nothing. I think having a finely tuned approach that does not come antagonistic, that does not come in the way of legitimacy, that can work across territories, focus on public health, on primary health, mental health, home care, that does not rely on infrastructure, but work on working force, recruiting tons of social workers, midwives, physician assistants, etc. And then work things bottom up, that these now you can fill a space that's not occupied by anyone and no one cares about, and it has little infrastructure. There's no development in it. You're not building concrete. You're just building people. And then rely on these organic forces going forward. Hopefully, once a political solution has been struck, you would have infrastructure that can actually execute whatever integration. But trying to just put people on the table, telling them we have to work together, you know what? We had COVID and we didn't work together. I don't know what else can.
I might add just a word. It's been my experience in post-war societies that the health sector is one that it's possible to reconstruct fairly quickly. There are big issues, especially with respect to corruption, because once you start centralizing procurement, there's a lot of money involved, even in a relatively not so well endowed health system. There's a lot of money. It has to buy masks, it has to buy syringes, it has to buy all sorts of stuff. So in Iraq, for example, you always see that Muqtada al-Sadr is always wanting the health ministry, because it provides services, but also because it provides.
Also has the Ministry of Health and Living.
Yeah. So it also provides some money that can be skimmed off. All that said, admitted, there's still no medical standards and behavior, and education. That's terribly important. So when I go to admittedly an English-speaking hospital in Beijing because I fell on the sidewalk one day on my new knee, who comes in as the orthopedist to look at my knee? It's a guy who was trained at Baylor, and they know the drill with the Americans extremely well. That kind of professionalism contributed enormously, I think, to the successful reconstruction, not even reconstruction, but construction of a primitive health system in Afghanistan during the American occupation. And the Taliban will be lucky if they're able to keep it. Iraq, a lot of corruption involved, but still there is medical care in Iraq today in a way that probably didn't exist once upon a time. So there are advantages and disadvantages in reconstructing medical systems. I would underline the advantages. I think it's one of the areas that if you can control the corruption, if you can keep procurement accountable and transparent, you can hope to improve the health standards very significantly in a decade, let's say, not in a year, but in a decade. I should stop there. Other questions? Please.
I actually have one. I'm the first year grad student here at SAIS. I actually have a question about identity in general. Do you believe that transnational identities that are very prevalent in the South and the Northeast could pose a serious citizens of the different types of government since the 50s have tried very, very hard to instill across the population. Thank you.
So I mentioned the South, just like Druze specifically, got transnational or
for example, different
Yeah.
types of tribes.
no? So I can speak about the Druze element because so we have now, and this is an identity kind of phenomena. So we have a Sweda American Society organization. So it's for Sweda people of anyone who come civically associated with Sweda. Majority Druze. Okay, so but that's the just the reality of it. But in essence, the identity is Sweda. When we fought strongly not to make it as Druze. Now there is another organization called American Druze Society. That's for Druze, and there we mingle around that common denominator. I think the problem with identities is kind of when they become political realities rather than cultural. So and that political reality comes from striving for security. So if you're tapping into my Druze circle to be secure, then that becomes a political reality and it becomes an issue. And transnational threat becomes transnational identities become an issue, like the same with the Kurds. But if what you're tapping into for your security is your local neighbor, it's a different story. You have a Syrian passport. It's the Syrian person who is dealing with the same sanction programs. It's the same issues you're having. My connection with my Lebanese Druze or Palestinian or Jordanian, it's a one of cultural identification and enriching a specific, I associate with the American Heart Association or with any professional association. They're not political realities. So I think that's the section. Once you know that your neighbor or you identify as your neighbor, that's where my political security is. That's the main identity that forms political entities.
I mean, I would argue it already has done what you're worried about, which is is dividing. I mean, it's absolutely tearing it. What does being a Syrian mean? And I think that that's something because that identity was so focused around the Ba'ath Party. And at least from the perspective of the government, it was very focused around what a Ba'ath Party member was, and obviously schools would instill this on students. It then became, if you were going to tear away from the Ba'ath Party, you ask yourself, well, what's left? Like, what is it that leads, continues to, connect me to the people on this panel as Syrians? And I don't think we have a good answer for that. And I think I don't know if there's ever going to be like one conclusive answer for that, because it definitely does mean something differently to different groups or different people as individuals. But talking about the political realities, I mean, in the Northeast, you have two competing factions of Kurds. We'll call them Kurds just for sake of simplification, but obviously there's many different groups, but there's two dominant ones, right? There's the KNC that is largely, more friendly with the Turkish government, and then you have the SDF SDC that is obviously has been, trying to create an autonomous region. And among those two groups of Kurds, obviously there's a lot of differences in terms of how to proceed forward, even as a Kurdish nation within the Syrian state, outside of the Syrian state, etc. But then on the Iraqi side, you do have, Masoud Barzani, even though he shares warm relations with Turkey, and he did shut the border down, I think, for a very short time period, he was under a lot of pressure to open it up because it was seen that you shouldn't be closing the door and the border to your fellow Kurds, even if you politically are not necessarily on the same page. There was a lot of pressure on them to find some things where there could at least be a continuous dialogue, etc. And you do find that a lot of Kurds from northeast Syria can travel safer, not say completely safe, but safer to Erbil than obviously than southern Turkey. And so sometimes those transnational identities can become, a connector, even, for certain ethnic groups that are across lines. And in some cases, like Meshid is saying with the Druze, it may not necessarily be that factor. So it really depends on both the politics and of those groups and also the individual identities and the goals of particular individuals affiliated with those political movements.
Let me just, because you mentioned, so it can become Like I'm saying, and if it's an option, like for Druze, there would be a faction telling you that we are Druze, should have a nation, something like all this nonsense, or not. And there are some structural elements that pushes towards one versus the other, but there's also human agency, kind of a thoughtful process of what's best strategic.
That basically even those transnational extensions of same religious group or ethnic group, they will look solid and unifying around or connection around the others, but when they look internally on themselves, they're going to also re-identify themselves. I'll give you, this is a real story. I just came back from Erbil, where our field program manager there, I had a chat with her husband, who's a Syrian Kurd, and he was not very pleased about Erbil, although it's a lovely city and the government is very welcoming of Syrians. Like, I grew up in Syria being identified as the Kurd. Like, I'm Syrian. Like, no, you're Kurd. And now, okay, I left Syria and now I live in Erbil and they call me the Syrian, although I'm a Kurdish like them. And like, so even it could be unifying actually among different neighborhoods. Actually, they couldn't reclass themselves for anything other than their wealth and social classes. So there's a joke like, oh, you look like Alawit al-Zahra. Like you look like you belong to al-Zahra Street Alawis, which is the second class Alawis comparing to the first class Alawis who's in Akrima and the other. So even that internally exists there, so let alone cross-border or transnational.
Well, we have Park Avenue, New Yorkers in Harlem. Though they're reversing their social status more recently. I would add one little footnote. It seems to me if there's a cross-border identity or series of identities that are going to make a big difference in the future in Syria, I think it's along the northern border. And especially the role of the Turkmen of Syria, reinforced by Arabs who are supported by Turkey. That really threatens the territorial integrity of Syria, not because the Turks want to be threatening the territorial integrity of Syria, but they have responsibilities. They have to execute. They have to govern these territories, and they've assigned the governance of those territories to the governors of the provinces on the other side, on their own side of the border. This is a very clever thing to be doing. It's much cleverer than assigning State Department officers to provincial reconstruction teams. But it also has very serious implications for the integrity of Syria as a state. That said, I would add one little footnote that my impression of Syrians, Majid, is a little bit more like your impression of Swiss. And that though it's absolutely true that they all have identities that they may emphasize over the Syrian identity in particular circumstances, I've never met a Syrian who didn't know they were Syrian, whether they were Kurd or Christian or Sunni or Shia. They all know they're Syrian. They may not favor that identity on first contact. And I find some hope in that, to tell you the truth. I think that's a very positive aspect of things. And maybe on that note,
As Syrians as Swiss are projecting to me, I'm fine.
well, that's pretty much what I wanted to say, that they do. Listen, I think we should all thank this extraordinary panel for a much deeper discussion of the situation inside Syria than we sometimes have in Washington, and appreciation to the two clubs for putting it on and to all of those who've attended. Thank you very much. Oh.